Father to Son, the Early Years, Chapter 31. The morning soon came around, and Sam had slept the entire time. He opened a bleary eye and looked at his clock. 8 a.m. Oh no, he muttered as he leapt out of bed. He hadn't intended to sleep more than a few hours, let alone through the night. He had wanted to go back to the hospital and be with Sarah. Dashing to the bathroom in a rather hasty manner, annoyed that he had slept so long, he quickly washed and went downstairs, where he could hear voices in the kitchen. "Good morning, son," Emily said. "Ma, you should have woken me up," he grumped loudly. "You needed rest, my boy." But Sam trailed off as he looked at his ma. He recognised the stare she was giving and thought better of finishing his sentence. He took his seat at the table with his aunt whilst the coffee was being poured. "Did anyone go and visit Sarah last night?" he asked. Rosie replied before Emily could say a word. "Yes, Jessie and I went for a while. She is doing fine, but still very tired." Sam smiled. He was relieved that she hadn't been completely alone. After finishing his coffee, he grabbed a slice of toast and stood up, saying he was going to find Tim and Jessie on the farm. His ma nodded, and quickly Sam left, before anything else could be said. Once outside, he soon caught sight of the others and headed in their direction. He isn't sure how he would have managed the farm if not for Jessie offering his help over the last couple of weeks. Tim couldn't manage it alone. Would have been far too much for one person. Tim strode across to greet Sam. "Good morning," he said with conviction and quite a cheerful tone. "Morning, Tim. How's it all going?" he asked. "You needn't worry, Sam. It is all under control. Trust me." This was one thing Sam did do. He trusted Tim completely. Over the time he had been at Delaney Farm, he had grown into quite a capable young man and had learnt so much. Laura's voice was heard in the distance, calling Tim, saying she would be late for work if he didn't hurry. Tim rolled his eyes in jest. "She worries too much," he said, laughing. "It's okay," said Sam. "I'm going to see Sarah, so I will drop her into work." Tim thanked him and said he had to go and sort out the fencing in the meadow. It was breaking down in places, but they would catch up later. Jessie had already started to make his way down into the meadow at this point, all tools in hand. He knew what he was doing, and Sam felt safe in the knowledge that if anyone could get to the bottom of what was causing this, Jessie could. Both men went their separate ways, and Sam signalled to Laura that he would take her. By the time he got to the house, Laura was ready and waiting, which was fine by Sam. He didn't want to have to hang around. He needed to be with his family. After a few moments, Sam was in the car, and they were heading out of the farm gates. Laura had loaded the back seat up with gifts for Sarah and started telling Sam about her trip out with Rosie yesterday. "I was beginning to wonder where all these bags had come from," he said, gesturing to the back seat. Laura giggled, and for a moment it was like Sarah was sat right beside him. They sounded alike at times. He guessed that growing up they were more like sisters than cousins, and so it was quite natural that they would pick up the traits from each other. It didn't take long to get into town. The roads were fairly quiet, and so it made for a faster journey. There was no doubt in Laura's mind how profoundly this had affected Sam. In truth, it had hit them all hard. The furthest thing from anybody's mind would have been what happened. She could see how devoted he was to her cousin, and she knew that Sarah felt the same. They were two halves of a whole. Anyone could see that. Laura reached into her bag as they pulled up to the hospital to grab her hairpins. Her fingers touched the gift from Christian. After all the events that had taken place, she had forgotten about it. She inwardly groaned and knew this wasn't going to be easy. Sam noticed the look on her face and asked if everything was okay. She grimaced a little and said, "It will be," as she lifted the parcel partway out of her bag. "Oh, right, yes, the mystery gift," he said, not sure if he should smile or frown. "He can have it back," replied Laura in a tone that Sam knew meant business. "Good luck with that," Sam said quietly. They both got out of the car and headed into the entrance together. Shortly after, Laura went one way and he headed towards the intensive care unit. He planned to see Sarah first, then the children. Laura had sent him with some of the bags and said she would be around later on her break and would bring the rest of them. As he reached her room, he took another deep breath and smiled as he opened the door. Peering in, he could see she was just waking up. "Good morning, my love," he said. As he watched her eyes open fully, he wasn't sure if anyone could ever understand how great it was to see a person open their eyes. "Good morning," Sarah replied with her sweet smile. Still pale, but looking better than yesterday, he thought. "How are you feeling?" "Better now you are here," she said. Sam walked round the bed and kissed her tenderly on the lips. Sarah looked at the bags on the floor and then looked at Sam. "Have you been shopping?" she asked, knowing how little he enjoyed doing that. "No, but your ma and Laura have," he replied with a wry smile. Meanwhile, back at the other end of the hospital, Laura was just preparing herself for the day ahead. She had placed her bags and work bag in her locker and was heading out of the door when Christian sauntered on by. She couldn't avoid him and she knew this. However, her natural instincts were screaming at her to hide from his view. But it was too late. He had already seen her. "Good morning, nurse," he said quite formally. This threw her a little, because she couldn't recall a time when he had been that formal with anyone. "Good morning, Dr. Jones," she replied in much the same manner. He didn't stop for any more in the way of conversation. Instead, he carried on walking through the corridor. Relieved, yet suspicious, she carried on to the nurse's station to find out the order of her day. After sorting her way through a mountain of paperwork, she had some idea of how her day would go, as far as her patients were concerned anyway. As for Christian, well, he was becoming more and more of an enigma, and she never knew from one minute to the next how he would behave. Trying hard to put him out of her mind, she started her rounds, and had become quite caught up in it. So much so she had little time to dwell on her greeting from Christian. She always liked to keep herself busy, and today she was certainly that. Time was passing fast, and before she knew it, her break time was looming. So she decided to walk to the nursery first and have a peek in on the twins. Just as she got there, her colleague had started wheeling the cribs out. She quickly ran over to hold the door and asked if she was taking them to see their mamma. "Yes, I am," replied the young nurse. "Why?" "Because I'm heading that way myself." "I will help you," she said. They both took hold of a crib each and pushed them down the corridors, talking about Christmas and what each of them had been doing. Laura explained that Sarah Delaney was her cousin, and although Christmas Day had passed well, the day after had been a big shock to all concerned. Finally they had made it to Sarah's door, and Laura peered around and said, "Are you up for some more visitors?" She nodded eagerly. The door opened wide and the babies were brought in. They needed to see their mamma and pa. Laura beamed with smiles. Sarah was sitting up now with Sam's help. It was clear to see she was eager to hold her children. Laura gently lifted them out of the cribs and gave them to Sarah. The look on Sarah's face was one that Sam knew he wouldn't ever forget. She had tears of love rolling down her cheeks. This was the first time she had got to hold them. It was everything Sam had imagined it to be. "We should think of names," he said, looking at the doting mamma. "Yes, we should. Do you have any ideas?" she asked as she continued to look at the two tiny bundles. Sam paused for a while, in deep contemplation. After all, their names would be a lifetime thing. "I would like to call our daughter Annabelle Rose," Sarah said with a smile, adding, "It means beautiful and graceful." Sam echoed the name a couple of times whilst looking at her. Then, after a few moments, he agreed it suited her. Sam was searching hard for a name for his son. He had spoken to his ma over this, and she had suggested Thomas, which means twin. "How about Thomas Patrick for a boy?" he said. Sarah thought about it for a moment or two, just as Sam had, when she suggested Annabel. Then, with a smile, she said, "Thomas Patrick and Annabel Rose it is." Sam picked up Thomas and cradled him in his arms. He could see his pa in those eyes, and he had the same gentle look that had often been seen from his father. Laura was beaming from ear to ear as she stood and watched the new parents cooing and holding their pride and joy. She reached into the bags that had been placed on the bed and drew out 2 teddy bears, one with a blue ribbon and one with pink. She placed them on the foot of each crib, saying, "These are from me. I bought them yesterday." Sarah reached out her hand to Laura as she passed and thanked her for everything. Many times she had wondered whilst growing up how she would have managed without Laura in her life, and she was happy to know that wasn't something she ever had to worry about. They were indeed like sisters and always had been. Laura looked at her watch and realised that her break was almost over. She didn't want to leave, but she knew she had to. "I will be back later," she said as she walked towards the door. "Duty calls." Sarah and Sam smiled at her. Both said goodbye as she left. Once out of the room, Laura walked back towards her workstation, smiling at the perfect names that had been given to the babies. In truth, she was feeling a little broody herself at this point, but she knew it would pass. It always did. Laura had her mind set on her nursing career for now. Maybe in time she would want children of her own, but not right away. It was a while before she saw anyone, and she was sat checking the charts of other patients when she heard Christian's voice floating up the corridor. He was being quite loud. It appeared he was chastising one of his nurses, more like humiliating her. At least that is how it seemed to Laura. "I'm sorry, Dr. Jones, it won't happen again," she heard the nurse saying, in a tone that spoke of fear. "Good. See that you don't, or next time I won't be so forgiving," he boomed at her. What had gotten into him? Laura thought quietly. Before she knew it, Christian was stood by her, glaring down with a wild look in his eyes. "Nurse, I need you to follow me," he ordered. Laura knew it wouldn't pay to tell him she was busy, and she quickly stood up. He walked at a pace that even she found hard to keep up with, but she managed to. He led her into the locker room. Laura knew this wasn't such a good idea, but she had little to say in the matter. "What can I do for you, Doctor?" she said in a voice that showed no sign of fear. "Oh, so it's Doctor now, is it?" he hissed. "Just being professional," she added without haste. He had shut the door behind him once again when she had entered the room, and he stood leaning on the door. "Did you get my Christmas gift?" he asked in a softer tone than before. "Actually, yes, I did, but I haven't opened it." She reached into her pocket for the locker key and proceeded to unlock it. She took the parcel out and pushed it in his direction. "I don't want it, so you can have it back," she said curtly. Christian didn't attempt to take hold of it, and for a few minutes Laura was stood holding it in mid-air. This was just another mind game he was playing, and she wanted no part, so she placed it on a small bench that was positioned on the side wall. "Why didn't you open it?" he asked, eyeing her suspiciously. "Because it's from you, and I want nothing more from you," Laura said. "For heaven's sake, Laura, it's just a gift." She shook her head, and then from out of nowhere she retorted with, "You can't buy my affections, Christian." As he stood there, his face started turning red with anger. "You belong with me, not with a no-brained farmhand," he spat. Her blood began to boil, and she really wasn't impressed with his wild assumptions on Tim. He didn't know him, and he had no right. "How dare you?" Laura hissed. "You know nothing about him." Christian was revelling in her anger and stood with a grin that spoke of victory. "I know enough. I know his own father was disappointed that he chose to give up on going into the banking business," he said calmly. "My, oh my, Christian, you have been busy, haven't you?" Laura had taken about as much as she was willing to take and went to make her way out of the door, pushing him to one side. As she did so, he took hold of her arm and held her against the door. "Don't deny it, Laura. You know you want me. You were just being stubborn." "No, Christian, I don't want you. You are wrong," she said, feeling scared now, just like she had before Christmas when he had her trapped in the staff room. He pushed his lips against hers and started to kiss her. He was being rough and was hurting her. She couldn't move away, and the more she tried to avert her mouth, the harder he pushed against her. With every bit of strength she could find, she pushed him away. "Don't ever do that again, or I will report you," she said, trying not to shout and attract attention. "Who do you think they'll believe? A simple nurse, or a doctor with a stack of degrees under his belt?" he sneered. "You are a real piece of work," she snapped as she walked out of the room, trying to keep her composure once again. She couldn't help but go over the last thing he had said. She worried that he could be right. He was nothing if not persuasive. She felt completely defiled by what he had just done. She was struggling to put one foot in front of the other. But she had, and made it to the restroom, where she locked herself away in a cubicle and just broke down in tears, sobbing silently. Laura had no idea how she would get out of this situation without losing her job. She knew she had to tell someone about this, but at work she confided in no one. She couldn't tell Sarah and Sam. They had enough to cope with. And Tim would be so angry, there would be no telling what he would do. Eventually she came out of the cubicle and walked towards the hand basins, where she threw cold water on her tear-stained face. Looking once again at her watch, she could see her shift was close to ending. She just had to get through the next hour and a half, and then she could leave. Her plan had been to get the bus back, but now she was hoping that Sam would still be around so she could tag along with him. Sam had helped take Thomas and Annabelle back to the nursery, as Sarah had started to feel tired. It had been a big day for her, and she needed her rest. He sat for a while with them and was chatting to the nurses on duty. He had been told that Annabelle had stolen their hearts, with her big blue eyes and blonde hair. Sam felt a sense of pride swell up inside him at that point, and he couldn't stop smiling. A short while later, Laura came up to the nursery and found Sam sitting there watching his children. She tapped lightly on the window, and Sam looked across. She signalled for him to come out, so he stood up and came to see what was the matter. Laura looked flushed and upset. "Are you okay, Laura?" he asked immediately. "I'm fine, just tired. Are you making your way home soon?" she asked. "Yes, do you need a ride back?" "I would appreciate it if I could," she said, trying to hold back tears. "Sure, no problem. Let me just go and check in on Sarah, and I will be with you." "Shall I meet you at the car?" Sam asked. She nodded, and Sam rushed off to see his wife. Laura wanted to get out as quickly as possible, so she began to make her way towards the parking lot, hoping not to bump into Christian. It had occurred to her that the gift she left in the locker room had vanished. All she could hope was that Christian had picked it up. She still had no clue as to what it was. Once at the car, she waited for Sam, who she could see was making his way across to her, but he had been stopped by one of her colleagues and stood chatting for a while. There was a tap on her shoulder, and she quickly spun around to find that Christian was stood behind her. Had he been spying on her? Had he been following her? All these thoughts came into her mind as she looked at him. "What, Christian?" she hissed venomously. "You are mine, remember that. I can make you or break you." She knew the making or breaking part was right, but as for the rest, he was so completely wrong. "I am not yours and never will be," she said in a calm tone. "Just remember when you kissed Farm Boy that my lips had you today. Remember that," he said triumphantly as he walked away with a smug look and jumped into his car. Laura turned to see Sam walking towards her. "Sorry about that. I've had many congratulations from the maternity staff, and that was another one," he said as he opened the car door for Laura. "No problem," she said brightly, trying hard to disguise her anguish. "Was that Dr. Jones I just seen you talking to?" Sam asked as he started the engine. Yes, he was just filling me in on some of the patients, she said. She didn't feel she could tell him the truth on this subject. It wouldn't have been fair. They drove back for most of the way, talking about Sarah and how well she was now responding. They both knew it would take a while before she was back to full strength, but both were positive it would happen. There was a lot of activity when Sam pulled into the driveway. There were trucks leaving with remnants of building materials loaded on the back. Each driver sounded their horn as they passed Sam. They must have completed the conversion, he said. It was the only reason he could think of at that stage. He knew they were close to finishing. Once parked up outside, Tim rushed over and opened Laura's door. It's finished, the house is complete, he said excitedly. Wow, said Laura, finished early? As it turned out, some of the people in town had heard what had happened to Sarah and had taken it upon themselves to rally round and help out where they could. Sam had been so completely wrapped up in the events of the last couple of weeks that he hadn't noticed. Come, take a look, exclaimed Tim. He was holding a set of keys and rattling them. They all made their way over to the new build, and Tim used the key for the first time. As the door opened, Sam was taken aback. The kind people of the town had not only helped to finish it, but also furnish it too. Welcome to my humble abode, said Tim in a very posh tone of voice. They all laughed, and he took them on a guided tour. It was small, but plenty big enough for Tim. Modest furniture, but cosy at the same time. So when are you moving in? Asked Sam. Tonight, he replied, laughing. He couldn't wait. He was so excited. Emily and Maggie had come across with bedding and soft furnishings that were surplus to requirements, followed closely by Rosie, who was carrying a dish full of homemade stew. Smells good, said Laura, as Rosie walked past. Will you join me for supper, Laura? Tim asked her, as he slid his arm around her waist. I would love to, she replied, feeling a little safer now than she had felt all day. There was something so calming about Tim. He made her feel like no other. She knew she had to talk to him, but not tonight. She didn't want to take away from his happiness right now. I think we should leave these two lovebirds alone, Emily said, winking at Laura. With words of congratulations and well done, everyone departed and headed back to the farmhouse. Once inside, they all sat down. I have an announcement to make, Sam said, standing up from the table. The twins now have their names, Thomas Patrick and Annabel Rose. There was no disguising his pride at this point, and Emily was reduced to tears. Your pa would be so proud of you, my son, so proud, she whispered, barely audible. Sam hugged his ma and kissed her on the cheek. I am as proud of you too, ma, he said.